She looked at me in the eye and she said, Pastor Bor, I want you to know that you offended me last night. I said, really? I'm really sorry I offended you. What do you mean I offended you? She says, well, you spoke badly about my church. And I said, really? I don't remember mentioning any church last night in my sermon. I didn't mention any church. I just gave a series of characteristics. She says, well, but you could tell by the characteristics what church you were talking about. I said, well, if you could tell by the characteristics what church I was talking about, then you should take it to heart, because I didn't even need to identify the church to you. Now let's take a look at those characteristics again. The Bible is graphic and clear about the identity of the harlot or Babylon. First of all, I want you to notice that in Scripture, a woman represents the church. A pure woman represents the pure church of Jesus Christ. A harlot woman represents a fallen church. And I want you to notice in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 1 that it speaks about a harlot, which is an apostate church. It says there in Revelation 17 verse 1, then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, come, I will show you the judgment of the great what? Of the great harlot who sits on many waters. And by the way, her name is Babylon, according to verse 5. Now, you know, I looked in Scripture, I looked in the concordance of Scripture, and I discovered something very interesting. In the Old Testament, Babylon is never called a harlot. In the Old Testament, almost in every single case that the word harlot is used, it is applied to Israel. In other words, it's applied to God's people. In other words, in Revelation chapter 17, we're talking about the Christian church that has become Babylon. Now, I want you to notice several other interesting details about this church. First of all, it's called a harlot. In other words, it is a church, but it's an apostate church. Secondly, this is a church that has worldwide extent, global extent. You say, how do we know that? Notice Revelation 17 and verse 1 again. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters. Now, what do the waters that she sits on represent? Well, let's go to verse 15 of chapter 17. It says, then he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. Are those the same groups that the first angel's message goes to? Absolutely. So what is the purpose of the first angel's message? It's to warn people about Babylon and to call people to come out of Babylon. Because the message goes to the same groups of people that Babylon controls and dominates. Are you with me on this point? Now I want you to notice something else that identifies this church, this apostate church. Revelation chapter 17 and verse 2. Tells us, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication. Is that true of Israel also? Absolutely. With whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. We'll come back to that later.